time of Christ's crucifixion is drawing closer, the events surrounding his physical life are pointing more directly towards his death. He's speaking more plainly to his disciples about that impending death. Matthew records not only Christ's words that discuss the upcoming crucifixion, but also some events that relate directly to it, particularly in this chapter. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 at this time. There the Bible says, "And it came to pass, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said unto his disciples, Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." Remember how in chapters 24 and 25, Jesus had taken his disciples out of the temple. This was after spending a lot of time in chapters 22 and 23 rebuking the Pharisees in the temple there. And then they walk outside the temple, and Christ shows them how large and awesome this building is, and then he explains to them that eventually this building is going to be entirely destroyed, to the point that not one stone will be left upon another. Now this statement raised some questions among the disciples, and he answered them, and he spoke to them about the destruction of Jerusalem that he was referencing, and about his second coming in chapters 24. And then in chapter 25, he spoke a great deal about the judgment and what that would be like. He then concludes those thoughts, not necessarily in chapter 25, but actually in these first 2 verses in 26, reminding the disciples that the Passover is coming in 2 days, and at that time he's going to be betrayed and handed over to be crucified. So Christ here not only predicts the time of his death, but the way in which he would be killed. And there's a great deal of prophecy and symbolism fulfilled just in the fact that he would be put to death on the Passover as a type of the Passover lamb. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on through this chapter. Then in verses 3 through 5, sort of shifts gear a little bit and kind of gives a parenthetical statement about what's happening behind the scenes, not necessarily with Christ and the apostles. But there it says, "Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But they said, Not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people." Now, Matthew records Caiaphas as the high priest here, while Acts refers to Annas as the high priest. And some might call this a discrepancy in the Bible. But when you look at parallel verses in Luke, who also wrote Acts, there he clarifies a little bit more that really one of them wasn't observed as the high priest by the Romans. They didn't really take too kindly, I believe it was to Caiaphas. So they sort of set up Annas as the high priest, at least in their eyes. But of course the Jewish people, understanding that Caiaphas was older and to be respected, they sort of viewed him as the sort of figurehead or the high priest to them. And actually this lends even more credence to particularly Luke's writings in Acts and also his gospel, because not only does he detail who specifically was the high priest, but he's able to detail the fact that, well, there's actually some discrepancy in this time, and probably only people who lived in that time and only certain people understood that, well, yes, really, Annas was the high priest, but the Jews still viewed Caiaphas as the high priest. There's some very subtle details in there that, again, prove the authenticity of many of the New Testament writings. But regardless of who was the official high priest, the Jewish authority here collectively gets together and states that they desire to get rid of Jesus permanently. But there was some contention over when they should do this. They probably shouldn't do it now, since the Passover was coming. It might cause a riot among the people who believed in Christ. At least many believed him to at least be a prophet, though many not truly the Son of God as he is. But despite what the Sanhedrin might have planned and how they would try to avoid the Passover, regardless, God's plan was to have Christ sacrificed on the Passover. And that was going to come to fruition no matter what the Sanhedrin wanted to do, no matter when they wanted to try and kill Jesus. It was going to happen the way God had intended. But knowing that the people would not take kindly to them putting Christ to death. They said that they would have to do it by subtlety or by trickery or lying. Since they weren't able to catch Christ in any real faults, they were going to have to try to find some other way to coerce some authority into putting him to death. And we know that one of the ways that they did this was by providing false witnesses at his trial. Then in verses 6 and 7, again it starts talking about what Christ and his apostles are doing. It says, "Now when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box, a very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat." And Matthew does a little bit of playing what I call the pronoun game. He says his and he, and not really specifically naming who it is, but of course we see from the context here that he and his is specifically talking about Christ. So we have Jesus here and his disciples who left for Bethany. This was a town just a few miles from Jerusalem. And this appears to be close to where Lazarus had been raised from the dead, as reported by John. Perhaps Simon the leper, who's mentioned here, was a relative of Lazarus, or maybe a neighbor. Regardless, it appears that Christ had probably cleansed this Simon of his leprosy. Even though he's still referred to as a leper here, I'm sure the people would be a little bit uncomfortable getting a little bit too close to him and eating with him. And considering how Christ was able to cleanse lepers and heal other illnesses, he probably cleansed Simon as well. We also see, if we look over at John's account, that Martha was there too in Simon's house. And this woman who pours ointment on Jesus is referred to as her sister Mary in John's account. We also see in that account that the reference is made to this ointment being spikenard. Mary takes this alabaster container that she has, this woman, and according to, again, Mark's account, when we put all these pieces together, we get a little bit more of the puzzle shaped up to see the whole picture. And in Mark's account, he states that she breaks it in order to release its contents. Now, some believe that this could have been opened in such a way that she wouldn't have had to break it, but then the problem would have been that it just would have trickled out, and she wants to pour it, all of it, out on the head of Christ. So she had to break it in order to release it in that manner. But because it was broken, then there's no way to contain the rest of the liquid. It would all have to be used up then, and also the container cannot be reused. And that seems like a very small thing to note, but the fact that she broke it just lends to how much of a sacrifice it really is for her to use all of this up for Christ. Again, she would then have to use all of it, and she also broke the container in the process. So she takes this very expensive ointment just to pour it on his head. And this, of course, does not go over well with all of the apostles. There's at least one that we know had some contention over this event. If we read verses 8 and 9, we see that. It says, "But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, 'To what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor.'" Again, when we look at other gospel writings, it points out that it is Judas Iscariot who complains about the so-called misuse of this ointment, calling it a waste, to just pour it on someone's head. Mark's account says that this would have been worth about 300 pence, which some estimate to be about $45 today. Now, I'm not quite sure how they get that math, but sometimes pence is referred to sort of a day's wage, so that seems like it would be worth a whole lot more. If you have 300 days worth of work in this one bottle, it would be a very expensive bottle, you would think, and all of that, of course, is sacrificed to Christ. Now, that amount, whether it was $45 or 300 days worth of salary, that would have been more than enough to help someone poor and needy. Of course, Judas's real motives are sort of come into question, considering his shifty dealings, and John calls Judas a thief in his gospel and says that Judas was the one, of course, who carried the money bag. So maybe it seemed like this would be an opportune way for him to obtain that alabaster container and the ointment in it and sell it and maybe pocket at least part of what it was sold for. But despite how much good it could have done for the poor, even if that was someone's true intent, Christ points out that her priorities were in the right place. Rather than to give it to the poor, but to sacrifice it for him. We see that in the next 3 verses. Picking up in verse 10, we read, when Jesus understood it, that is, when he understood what they were believing or had thought about the use of this ointment, he said unto them, why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. For in that she had poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Now, if the disciples honestly wanted to do good for the poor, well, they're going to still have opportunity to do good for the poor, even after Christ is gone. But this was Mary's last chance to make a sacrifice like this for Christ. She had put Christ above all else in her life, and she sacrificed what she had at the time. Christ also points out that this was in preparation for his burial. We see where ointments and fragrances and spices and other things were often used in the burial process. In fact, in John chapter 19, verse 39, there's a record there of the Jewish practice of covering the body in spices and other things like myrrh, either for possibly for preservation or to keep it from smelling as quickly. And in John 19, we see that there it is Nicodemus who had brought 100 pounds of spices to lay on the body of Christ. So this was all part of this sort of embalming process that they participated in at the time. Maybe in this instance it is just symbolic, but nonetheless it is anticipating the crucifixion. It also shows Mary's commitment to Christ and willing to give much for him, expecting nothing in return. And Christ points out that wherever the gospel is preached, her story will also be told. And sure enough, this event is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. So she is certainly remembered for her sacrifice and for her dedication to Christ above all else. Let's read verses 14 through 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests, and said unto them, what will ye give me, and I will deliver him unto you? And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. It seems that the events surrounding the alabaster box maybe was the last straw for Judas. Both Matthew and Mark record this event as taking place immediately after Mary pouring out the ointment. And greedy Judas goes to the chief priest to sell out Christ. They agree upon 30 pieces of silver as the price for turning in Christ. This was prophesied in Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13, and that's recorded as the price given to the potter in that Old Testament passage. Again, more specific details line up with the events that are all surrounding the crucifixion. Now, there's some debate over the symbolism in this 30 pieces of silver. Some say that it was the price for a slave. Now, when I looked it up, that was specifically the price given if it happened to be that like an ox were to push or gore a servant, then the owner of the ox would then have to pay the owner of the servant 30 pieces of silver. Maybe that's what people are trying to draw together from this. Regardless, it was not worth the life of the only begotten of God. And the point is, regardless, again, Judas is not caring so much about Christ. He's caring about his own pockets, and it's a pretty sharp contrast when we just read about how much Mary was willing to give to Christ and how little Judas is willing to turn Christ over for. And then the Bible says that from this point on, that Judas was sort of just looking for a good opportunity to hand Christ over. And this time, of course, we know was coming very shortly. Verses 17 through 20. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The Master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house. with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. Now I like the accounts in Mark and Luke better, just because they give us, again, a little bit more detail. But when you look at all of the prophecies and sort of specific points that surround this event, when you look at those other accounts, we see how much more powerful Christ's all-knowing abilities are. In Mark and Luke's accounts, Christ says when they go into a city, you're going to see a man and he's going to be carrying a pitcher, and then you're going to follow that man and he's going to go to this specific house and you're going to ask him for a specific place to allow us to eat the Passover, and he's going to show you this large upper room, and that's where we're going to eat the Passover. And all of that's just kind of brushed over in Matthew's account. He just says you're going to go in, you're going to find such a man, and then we're going to have the Passover there. But there are a lot of details that Christ knew, and it's very impressive to consider how Christ was aware of every single detail. He didn't say, okay, I know this guy named John, and you're going to go talk to him, and he lives on this road. He says, no, you're going to go, and you're going to find a man carrying a pitcher. Christ already knew there was going to be one man carrying a pitcher down the specific road. He knew he owned a house that had a large upper room, and that he would be willing to let them eat the Passover with him. When you consider all those details that Christ knew beforehand, again, I think it's just much more impressive to consider Christ's all-knowing capabilities, and it just, again, proves that he is God on earth. And then, of course, they do meet in this upper room, and he sits down with the 12 apostles. At sundown, of course, that's when they would be able to eat the Passover. Verses 21 through 25, we start to get into Christ, again, predicting more about his crucifixion and betrayal. And as they did eat, he said, verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And they were exceeding sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, Lord, is it I? And he answered and said, he that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. The Son of Man goeth, as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? He said unto him, Thou hast said. Again, here's Christ predicting his betrayal, which, as we read, is sort of already partway in the works. And of course, every disciple, as they sort of go down the line, when they know one of them is going to be the betrayer, they ask, well, is it me? Is it me? But that seems like something that they should know. I understand not being able to predict whether or not you're going to be one of the disciples who's going to suffer a violent death and want to be curious about that. But shouldn't you know if you're going to be the one who would betray Christ? Shouldn't you know in your heart if you're that kind of person? Shouldn't you know if you've taken steps to already sort of go down that path? You would think it would be obvious to all of them. Nonetheless, again, Christ makes an accurate prediction. He states that whoever dips their hand in the dish with him is going to be the one who will betray him. And that, yes, it is predicted that Christ would die in such manner, but even still, it would have been better, because again, every man has free will. It would have been better for that man if he had not even been born. This, of course, is Judas, and we see that Christ knows the heart of Judas, knows his mind, and knowing that his betrayal, and therefore his death are at hand, Christ is then going to go on in the next few verses to set up a memorial, not only for his apostles, not only for the first century church, but also for us. Verses 26 through 28, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup, and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Now, of course, we're all very familiar with all of these symbols. The bread, of course, represents the body of Christ. The fruit of the vine represents his blood. And, of course, as he states here, the cup stands for the New Testament or the New Covenant. The words are translated interchangeably based on the context, but the original Greek word is the same, testament. And and covenant. And this again is fulfilling more of these anti-type relationships that we're familiar with when comparing things in the Old Testament that look a lot like things in the New Testament. When we consider the Passover lamb and how it would represent Christ and how the blood would be collected in a basin, to me is very reminiscent of the cup, which would contain the fruit of the vine, representing the blood of Christ. And of course we see also, again, more of Christ's predictions. In John, he stated to his followers that they would eat his body and drink his blood. And of course many were offended at this and of course didn't want to have anything to do with cannibalism because they didn't quite understand. But many departed from him, didn't want to partake of that. But of course it's him referencing this institution of his supper in a sort of spiritual sense, in a symbolic sense, but not in a literal sense. But again, he had predicted that before, and here he is fulfilling it just before his death. Then verses 29 and 30. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung an hymn, they went out unto the Mount of Olives. Christ knew that the kingdom would be established through his death, burial, and resurrection. And all of that would occur before he could participate in this again. Now, many interpret this a little bit differently. Some believe that this is supposed to be something he's referring to far in the future in the heavenly kingdom after the judgment. To me, it seems more plain that Christ participates in the communion with us in a spiritual sense every time we partake of the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day. And again, that's because the Christian kingdom has already been established. His new kingdom has come to fruition through his death, burial, and resurrection. And of course, after they are finished with this supper, they sing a hymn, possibly a psalm that we might even have recorded today. And then they leave the upper room and go out into the Mount of Olives. And then verses 31 and 32. Then saith Jesus unto them, All ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. But after I am risen again, I will go before you into Galilee. Christ knew that the apostles would be scattered, and they would deny him according to many Old Testament scriptures. Here he's referring to Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7, but there are other scriptures that point this out, like Isaiah 53. He also knew that he would rise from the dead, and he was already making plans to meet with them again in Galilee after some time after the resurrection. Of course, that is where they end up meeting up. Jesus is there walking along the beach. So maybe this was Christ sort of setting up this appointment, this sort of meeting place in their mind so that they would know where to wait for him. Though they probably didn't want to be anywhere near Jerusalem itself. There was probably a lot of contention still between the Jews and those who were thought to be Christ's followers at the time, just close to the crucifixion, so they probably didn't feel safe there, so it was probably best for them to leave and go to a nearby place like Galilee. So Christ points that out to them, and of course that's where all of this occurs. Again, Christ making many predictions. Let's read verses 33 through 35. Peter answered and said unto him, Though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto you, that this night before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. Peter said unto him, Though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee. Likewise also said all the disciples. As we've mentioned, I don't know how many times since we started going through the gospel, here's Peter again being Peter. There's a term that we threw around in school called being a gunner. That's somebody who just wants to get the answer right all the time. They want to be the first one in line for everything. They want to do everything just right. They want to answer all the questions. If the professor asks a question to somebody, they're going to be the first one to raise their hand. And they want to be there in the moment all the time. And Peter's sort of that way a little bit. I don't think he's quite as competitive as some of the other people that I've met like that. But of course, as always, Peter is the first one to speak up, and it's not always bad. Here, though, he's, not able to really put his money where his mouth is, as it were. His mouth writes a check that his body's not willing or able to cash. He can't quite go as far as he's willing to say he can. Christ is making a specific prediction that comes true, but again, Peter, even though Christ said all of them were going to deny him or be offended because of him, Peter says, well, yeah, maybe all of them, but not me. That he says that he would be willing to die for Christ. Now, he would eventually get to that level of faith, and he would die for the cause of Christ eventually. But when Judas comes with those to arrest Jesus, Peter again is not actually willing to go as far as he thinks he is. At least in that moment, he didn't quite have all the faith that he would need in order to stand up to that sort of trial. But as we pointed out before, we're all a little bit like Peter. We all make mistakes. We all maybe speak up a little bit sooner than we should. And we all have room to grow. That's the lesson that I have this evening for this first half of Matthew chapter 26.
Matthew 26, verse 35, the Bible says, Peter said unto him, though I should die with thee, yet I will not deny thee. Or verse 36, sorry. Then cometh Jesus with him unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto the disciples, Sit ye here, while I go and pray yonder. He took with him Peter, the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then saith he unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here, and watch with me. As you recall from the previous chapter last Wednesday, Christ had observed the Lord's Supper with his apostles, and then he said that to his disciples that they would forsake him. Peter disagreed with Christ on this and said, I will never forsake you. And Christ told Peter that you will deny me. You will deny me. And the cock will crow. And then Peter again says, Christ, no, I will die before I deny thee. And then the others, their disciples, also said they would do the same. And then we have Peter. We have Christ then coming into a place called Gethsemane. And this is a garden. This is a garden that was frequented by Christ and his disciples, a place that Christ particularly liked to go. And this is where he was going to pray. And so he says in verse 6, he says to his disciples, Sit here, basically wait here while I go and pray over yonder. However, he takes with him three people. He takes with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which is John and James. He takes them with him to go into where he's going to pray to his Father. And he says in verse 38 that his soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. And so this is something that was weighing hard on Christ. He knew what was about to transpire with him being scourged, with him dying on the cross. And this, of course, was weighing heavy on him. This is something that, not to this level, obviously, for us, but something that, we could identify on a small level if we have something coming up that we're nervous or anxious about, something that we don't want to go through. Perhaps we talked about surgeries in the opening. Perhaps there are those who are going through major surgeries coming up, and they have anxiety or worry about those that we have. We talked about, we mentioned that there are those who unfortunately have cancer and are facing, have terminal cancer and facing death. That can be something that they weighs heavy on them, that they can be, identify with Christ here as far as being exceedingly sorrowful. However, of course, Christ, he knew that he was going to die, and this is weighing on him. But not only that he was going to die, We talk about those who are terminally ill, they bring in hospice and they make them as comfortable as possible. It'd be the exact opposite for Christ in the fact that he was going to die an excruciating death. He was going to die one of the worst deaths anybody could possibly have to go through. And so given this, this is weighing heavy on him. And he says in verse 38, tarry here and watch with me. So he tells them to stay here and watch with him, perhaps watch out, because he knew that people were coming for him, and so watch out for perhaps that may be coming to pass. So he tells them to watch, and then in verse 39 it says he went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "Oh my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless not as I will, but as thou wilt." And so he goes a little farther. There's a verse that I've written down that says it was about a stone cast, but I don't memorize that verse. But it's about a stone's cast, is what the Bible says. So he separated himself from James, John, and Peter here, and he went kind of what Christ talked about is if you recall how he talks about when you go to pray, go into your secret place, go into somewhere private where you can talk with God, and reminded me of what Christ is doing here. And so he's separating himself and going to pray to his Father. And of course, we see him praying here, praying, "Oh my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." So Christ here praying that if it be possible to let this cup pass from him. And this cup that Christ is referring to is not a literal cup, but it is the anguish, the torture that he is about to go through. And so he's asking God, his Father, let this cup, let this anguish, this torture, the pain he's about to go through, let this pass from him. Meaning, if there's any way for him to avoid this, let it be. However, he says, not as I will, but as thou wilt. So Christ praying for this, that he is going to obey God. And if God's will is that he must go to the cross, then so be it. Of course, we know Christ here. We know Christ loves his Father. He loves us. He loved his disciples. And so he is not praying here that he may be able to be saved from the cross and everybody else is lost, because he doesn't die on the cross. No, he's saying if there be any other way for us to be saved, and he is able to avoid this horrible pain and suffering, let it be. Of course, we know there was no other way for us to be saved. Christ had to die on the cross. Then in verse 40 it says, "And he cometh unto his disciples, and findeth them asleep, and saith unto Peter, What? Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And so he comes to his disciples, and he finds them asleep. And he here, and seeing his disciples, he goes right after Peter. Peter, who, as we talked about in previous chapters, is kind of the most outspoken, most bold. He would say he would die for Christ, that Christ was wrong, and saying that Peter would deny Christ. And so Christ comes to Peter and basically kind of saying, "Hey, you said you'd be willing to die for me, but you can't even stay awake 1 hour for me." And so Christ kind of calls Peter out specifically, and then the others for falling asleep. And he says in verse 41, "Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation." Watch and pray. Watch. Be aware of what's going on. Be aware of this particular case, what's about to happen, so you're not tempted to do wrong in times of distress, in times of trial, which they're about to go through. They should be at this time they shouldn't be sleeping, they should be praying. They should be praying to God to help them for what is about to come to pass. As Christ, directs this to Peter, he's basically kind of directing it to Peter, saying, you should be listening to these words, Peter, because you should be praying, watching and praying, that you do not enter into temptation, not give in to temptation, the sin that you're about to commit, that I know you're about to commit. You should be praying to your Father to help you overcome those things. Of course, we know Peter fails in that. He says, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. The mind, the heart is willing, but the flesh is weak. So no doubt Peter and our disciples, they wanted to stay awake. They wanted to do what Christ said and watch. When Peter said he would not deny Christ, he meant it. He did not want to not deny Christ. He believed that he would not. But however, even if the mind and heart are willing, the flesh is weak. The deeds done in our body can be very different from what our heart may say, our mind may think, when the times of adversity, the times of temptation come. We can say that we will never drink again. We can say that we'll never lie again. And we can say that we'll never be offended again because of Christ. But the time of trial comes, the time of temptation comes, when we are put to the test. What will we do? And with Peter, we got to be aware of the dangers, be aware of the devil trying to come after us like a roaring lion, and not let our guard down, not be overconfident like Peter. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12, Paul says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. And of course, when we talk about, when Christ talks about the spirit indeed is willing but the flesh is weak, we can't do like others out in the world and say, well, this is my excuse for why I sin. The flesh is weak and I just can't control it. No, Christ says, yes, you can control it if you watch and pray. If you do your best to recognize the temptation, recognize it when it comes, and then be strong enough to take that way of escape that God gives us. In verse 42 it says, he went away again the second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then cometh he to his disciples and saith unto them, sleep on now, and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So Christ goes away again, the second time, and prays, this time praying kind of in a way saying that he's realizing this is going to happen. He says, if this cup may not pass away from me except I drink it, thy will be done. So Christ basically praying that, given that this is God's will, that he must drink this cup, and he must go through the agony, the pain, the torture, and the cross. God's will be done. So he comes back again and he finds them again sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. He leaves them again, goes away and prays the third time, saying the same words. Christ here praying 3 times for this reminded me of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 8, where Paul goes to God and cries and seeks to let the Lord 3 times to pray and to have the thorn in his flesh removed. So we find Christ here praying 3 times, the Apostle Paul praying 3 times. This is something that we can learn from as well, that if we have a great desire, that we need to go to God, not just once for it, we go to God multiple times. Let God know how great our desire is to have our petitions granted. Then, in verse 45, after praying the 3rd time, he comes back to his disciples. He sees them. He says unto them, sleep on now, take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. This as he is saying this to them, he's saying, sleep on now, as though they're still asleep. And basically it looks like he's kind of like, like a mother would talk to her child who's sleeping, and a mother talking to a child, saying things to the child. And this is kind of like, Christ here, talking even though they're asleep. He's saying these words to them. And he's saying, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So he calls out those who are about to take him, calling them out for being sinners. Verse 46, it says, rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. While he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with the swords and staves, from the chief priests and the elders of the people. And now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, the same as he, hold him fast. Forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And so Christ says, Rise to his disciples, let's be going, because behold, he is at hand that doth betray him, of course, that being Judas. And so as Christ is speaking these words, here comes Judas, of course, one of the 12 apostles, and with him a great multitude of men with swords and staves to take Christ. And he says in verse 48, now he that betrayed him gave him a sign, saying, whoever shall I kiss, the same as he, hold him fast. So Judas had talked to these men who were going to take Christ, and says, he that I go and kiss, he is the one that you need to take, that you need to hold him fast. So Judas comes to Christ, and he says, Hail, Master. Judas here is betraying Christ. He's about to turn Christ over to the chief priests and elders who wanted to kill him, and yet he is here saying, Hail, Master. Remind me of Luke 6, verse 46, where Christ said, And why you call me Lord, Lord, and do not those things, the things which I say. So Judas kisses him, signaling that this is the one that they need to take. And Jesus replies to him, saying, Friend, wherefore art thou come? And so Christ, of course, knowing what's going on, but says, why you're coming to me like this. And he says, friend. And this word friend in the Greek is heterios, which means companion. But when we look at how this Greek word is used throughout the Bible, it's connected with things that are negative or not in the best light. The word friend, or the Greek word heterios, is used in Matthew 22, verse 12, when it talks about the friend who isn't wearing the proper wedding garment. Also in Matthew 20, verse 13, this Greek word is used for friend when talking about those who had worked the entire day in the field and agreed to it for a penny wage, and then those came after them and worked for like 1 hour and got the same amount of money, got a penny. And then the man comes up and says, hey, we slaved in the field all day, thinking, hey, don't we get more? And I replied to him, saying, friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst thou not agree with me for a penny? So we see this Greek word, heterios, used in kind of a negative sense in the Bible. And it's usually associated with those who are supposed to be a friend, but they're not acting like a friend. And that's exactly what Judas is doing here. He's supposed to be Christ's friend, but he is definitely not acting like a friend in the fact that he's betraying him. Verse 51, it says, And behold, one of them which Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and smote off his ear. Then said Jesus unto him, Put up again thy sword into its place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled? That thus it must be. And so, verse 51, we see one of them, which of course is Peter, stretched forth his hand and drew his sword out and cut off one of the high priest's servants' ear. And we see Jesus here telling Peter to put up his sword into its place. We know that from John chapter 18, we know that this man, this servant that had his ear cut off, his name is Malchus. And we also know that when, in verse 11, that same thing here where Christ told Peter to put his sword in the sheath. He says, the cup which my Father had given me, shall I not drink it? Again, Christ referring to the cup that he must drink, that being the torture of the cross that he must go through. And so Christ here tells Peter to put up his sword. Also, what we don't see here in these verses in Matthew, that Matthew doesn't cover, is the fact that Christ healed this servant. Luke covers it, Luke 22 and verse 51, where he says, and one of them smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus answered and said, suffer ye thus far? And he touched his ear and healed him. And so Christ heals this servant's ear. And we see Peter is, you think about Peter striking this servant, he's, first of all, you think about it, cut off his ear, how close, just a few inches, the other way, he's striking him in the middle of his head, cutting his head in two, but thankfully he just got his ear. But, you think about, what's going through Peter's mind. Perhaps he's thinking about what he told Christ, that, hey, I said I'm willing to die for you, and here I'm going to show you that I'm willing to die for you, because they're bringing multitudes of people with swords. Peter probably wouldn't stand much of a chance against all those men. And so Christ tells him to put the sword back, and he says, for all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Those that depend on the sword for their livelihood and look to go out and kill others, eventually they're going to have their day. They're going to meet somebody who is stronger or better than them, or somebody who is more cunning and perhaps sneaks up on them, and eventually they will pass by the sword. And so then Christ says, thinkest thou that I cannot pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels. Legion, from what I understand, is 3,000 to 6,000. And so Christ says he can pray to his Father and give him more than 12 legions of angels, which would be anywhere from 36,000 to 72,000 angels. Of course, one angel could have easily taken out all these men. But Christ tells him, if I do that, or if we go against these men and don't allow them to take me, then how shall the scriptures be fulfilled? How shall, for example, Isaiah 53 be fulfilled, that prophesies about the crucifixion, the death of Christ. Christ had to be taken in order to die for the sins of men. In verse 55, it says, in that same hour, said Jesus to the multitudes, are ye come out as against a thief with swords and staves for to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and ye laid no hold on me. But all this was done, that the scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled, and all disciples forsook him and fled. And so in this same hour, we find Christ saying to the multitudes here, they're taking him, saying, you're coming at me, you're coming and taking me like I'm a thief with all your swords and staves. But he says, I sat daily in the temple teaching you, and you didn't lay hold on me then. And so obviously then I guess you felt that I wasn't an enemy or doing anything wrong. So now why? Why now do you take me? Of course, we know that they wanted to take Christ when he was alone, and not a bunch of people around him, because the people in the temple took him as a prophet. He's more than a prophet. He is the Son of God. But given that they were scared, they were basically scaredy cats. They did not want to take Christ in the temple, because they know there would be a lot of backlash from the people. And then again, Christ says in 56, or it says in verse 56, that all this was done again that the scriptures might be fulfilled. And of course, we see one of the scriptures being fulfilled that's in this same chapter, that the disciples would forsake Christ. And then we see verse 56 is coming to pass as the disciples forsook Christ and fled. And then in verse 57 it says, and they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. So we see that they take Christ and they lead him away to Caiaphas the high priest, which was mentioned in this chapter in verses 3 and 4, which Chris covered. And so now, and back in verses 3 and 4, they were surmising on how they could take and kill Christ. And now here's their opportunity, thanks to Judas. So now they're all assembled here. And it says in verse 58 that Peter followed afar off. He didn't want to be seen. He follows them to the high priest's palace, and he goes in and he sits with the high priest's servants, and it says to see the end. So perhaps Peter was thinking, as Christ had talked about his death, perhaps Peter thinking this was going to be the time that they would kill Christ. In verse 59 it says, now the chief priests and elders and all the council saw a false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came two false witnesses, and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, answer thou nothing? What is it? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by living God, that thou tell us whether thou be Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. So here we see Christ going through this trial. He had first gone, which is not mentioned here, to stand before Annas in John chapter 18, verse 12 through 14, and then he goes to Caiaphas here, and then he goes before the Sanhedrin, councils we see in Luke 22, verses 63 through 71, and then of course he goes before Pilate. Pilate says no, he needs to go to Herod. Herod wants nothing to do with him, so I think it says that Herod wanted him to perform a miracle and all this, and Christ wouldn't do it. Herod sends Christ back to Pilate, and Pilate, says, I find no fault in this man, but turns him back and gives in to what the Jews wanted, him being crucified. So we see Christ basically being tried 6 times. And then, so we see Christ before these men, and they're trying to bring false witnesses to Christ, for Christ to put him to death. But it says they found none, meaning they couldn't find a false witness that actually had a halfway decent, believable story. But then, to their joy, they found a couple that were able to give a decent false account of something that Christ says, and that of course Christ is talking about destroying the temple of God and building it in 3 days. Of course, we know Christ is not talking about literally doing this, but he's talking about in a spiritual sense, and of course, talking about him being crucified and then being raised the third day. And so the high priest hears these false witnesses say that Christ says this. He goes to Christ, says, hey, you have no answer to these men which are against thee, these false witnesses, that he calls them witnesses that are against thee. And Jesus holds his peace, and then the high priest, getting frustrated, says, I adjure thee. Adjure meaning to, in the Greek, means for an oath. So he's saying, hey, I want you basically, by even an oath to say, whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus replies, saying that hereafter that he shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Of course, this is Christ talking about the day of judgment. And then the high priest then makes a big show, gets all upset, tears, rents his clothes. He's saying that Christ has spoken blasphemy. He's like, why do we even need any more witnesses? We're all now witnesses of what he said. You have all heard that he has said blasphemy. And then he asks the other men of council there, what do you think? And they all say he is guilty of death. And no surprise, as the council here had already determined that Christ would be guilty of death even before Christ entered the room. Verse 67, it says, then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and the others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? And so now they start to get after Christ, spitting in his face, buffeting him, in the Greek, hitting with the fist. Others smote him with the palms of their hands. And then they start to make fun of him as they're hitting him, asking to prophesy unto them as far as who is hitting him. It was the smoting thee. We know from Luke chapter 22, verse 64, that they had blindfolded Christ before they started doing these things to him, so Christ could not see with a blindfold on who was hitting him. And so they were basically making fun of him and saying that, asking him that by prophecy, let us know who is hitting you, even though he cannot see. Verse 69 through the end of the chapter, it says, now Peter sat without in the palace, and the damsel came unto him, saying, thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. He denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. When he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto them that were there, this fellow was also Jesus of Nazareth. And he again denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him that stood by, and said to Peter, surely thou art one of them, for thy speech arrayeth thee. Then he began to curse and swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which saith unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. And so Peter is now still here. We recall he was watching outside the court to see, quote unquote, the end. And so he's out here just outside the court. It says in Luke 22 that they had started a fire, and he was gathered around the fire with the high priest's servants. And so this damsel, which is just a servant or a maid of the high priest, comes and says, thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. So here we have the first denial by Peter, saying, I know not what's thou saying. And then it says that he went out unto the porch, and another maid saw him, different maid saw him, and said unto him that he was there. He is a fellow also with Jesus of Nazareth. And here we find Peter now denying it with an oath, saying, I do not know the man. And then it says, after a while he came unto him and stood by him, And another man came to Peter and said, Surely thou art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. This man who third time come to Peter saying that he is surely one of Christ's disciples, for his speech bewrayeth thee. This is covered more in Mark 14, verse 70, where he says, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth there too. This word bewrayeth thee, simply means certain, evident, or clear. So it's clear by your voice that you're a Galilean who walks or is a disciple of Christ. And of course, the third time Peter begins to curse and swear, and then say, I know not, the man denying to know Christ. And then as Christ told him, immediately the cock crew. And then Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said to him before in this chapter, in 33 verse 35, that before the cock crow thou shalt deny thrice. And we see Peter going out and weeping bitterly. We get more color on this from Luke. In Luke chapter 22, verses 59 through 62, Luke tells us that the time between Peter's first denial of Christ and his third denial of Christ was about an hour. Also, he says in verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. This is after Peter denied Christ the third time. The Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord. I said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And so here we find that Peter was close enough for Christ to be able to see Peter. And most likely Peter is able to see Christ, so the Lord looks on Peter. Peter probably sees Christ looking at him, and they probably make eye contact, and then Peter remembers as he sees Christ looking at him. He remembers the words that Christ said that Peter would deny him 3 times. And of course, this had to be in a very emotional moment for Peter, as one, he realizes that Christ was right, he was wrong. He said he would even die for Christ, and here he is rejecting or denying Christ just in his words. And also, as he sees the Lord looking upon him, he knows that Christ now knows, of course, that Peter has denied him 3 times. And of course, upon this, we see Peter going out and weeping bitterly. But thankfully for Peter, he did not do as Judas did, and after sinning against Christ, feeling so bad, he just goes out and kills himself. And no, Peter had a godly sorrow for what he did. He wept bitterly, of course, and we know that Peter repented of his sin. He did not go out and kill himself, sending himself to a devil's hell, but instead he made things right with God. He made things right with Christ by immediately having this godly sorrow, weeping and repenting of his sins. And I say it's sins because he denied Christ 3 times, and then he swore with an oath, which he shouldn't be doing, and then he cut off the servant's ears, so he basically sinned 5 times before even Christ went to the cross. This concludes our chapter study of Matthew chapter 26. We never close service without offering the invitation. Of course, we know to obey the gospel, we must first hear the word of God. We must believe that which we have heard. Upon believing that which we have heard, we must make it up our mind to go and sin no more, to repent of our sins, and then confess with the mouth that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and then finally be buried in water grave baptism for remission of our sins. If anyone here tonight who's taking these steps, but you have made sin, you need to pray to the church, you too can come forward, and please come forward while we stand and sing. Song of invitation selected.